Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Arthur C. Clarke. Any sufficiently analysed magic is indistinguishable from science. Larry Niven. It doesn't stop being magic just because you know how it works. My favourite author in the world, Terry Pratchett. When I'm running D&D or any TTRPG and there is magic involved, I want wildness, I want mystery and wonder. I also want my players who are playing spellcasters to feel powerful and to let them roll lots of dice. But for me, and maybe for you too, magic in TTRPGs feels mechanical. It works the same every time and we know what we're going to get. The big question, how do we make magic feel magical? What if players could keep that sense of joy and discovery even as their characters are becoming masters of their arcane craft? Let's dive into the weave of magic to see if we can't unpick some of the cliches and conventions of magic systems in TTRPGs and maybe build something better. My name's Rich and this is Renegade Rolls. For me, when I'm a player in TTRPGs, magic doesn't feel magical because, well, I know exactly how it works. It's been sufficiently analysed so that when I cast a spell, it just happens, pretty much the same every time. This applies to most of the big systems out there, certainly in D&D and Pathfinder, as well as loads of others, with a few honourable exceptions, but we'll get to them later. The magic systems in these games can be thought of as hard magic. In fantasy storytelling, there is a spectrum between hard and soft magic. There's also hard and soft focus, gritty versus heroic fiction, and a whole load of other axes we could add to the setup, but those are topics for other videos. Hard magic is where the rules around how it works can be codified and can be understood by the readers over the course of the story, even if the protagonists don't know what they're doing. Brandon Sanderson is the master of this with tables and charts which govern how different forces interact. Soft magic is where the rules are never fully revealed to the reader, although some protagonists might know, but they never share their knowledge. The seminal text that probably had the biggest influence on fantasy TTRPGs as we know them is The Lord of the Rings. I was going to use it as an example in here on the soft side, saying that, oh, we know how the One Ring was forged and what it can do, but nobody knows why it works. But then I got absolutely schooled by my friend Callum. Look at all this. Thank you, by the way, so much for this. In the books or the films of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, not including the deeper lore from other books or the series, the reasons for the power of the ring are kept from us, mostly because we're experiencing the story from the perspective of the hobbits as they explore a world much bigger than themselves, rather than from the viewpoint of Gandalf or Galadriel, who might have been more able to shed light on the situation. A true soft magic system would be something like in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. They do a lot of studying and a lot of research, but the true magic in the world is wild and chaotic. We do get occasional glimpses of its limits, in some cases self-imposed ones, like when Jonathan Strange is asked if he could kill someone with magic. He says, "Well, I suppose a magician might," he admitted, "but a gentleman never would." There's also hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi. I'd argue that Star Trek leans more towards hard sci-fi, with most of the things that we see as miraculous having some sort of technical basis as being possible, even if it's explained through some techno-babble. Star Wars, on the other hand, at least in the original trilogy, can be thought of more as soft sci-fi. The spaceships and lasers are pretty much understandable to us viewers, but what about the Force? Again, we see the universe from the eyes of someone young and naive, exploring it for the first time, seeing Luke Skywalker being amazed along with the audience at the things he sees along the way. Some questions for you. Is the Star Wars universe more enjoyable because they introduced the concept of midichlorians? Is the Rings of Power, where we learn the origin of the One Ring, a better story than the original trilogy? Now that I've thoroughly upset some of the biggest and most famously pedantic fan bases around, I'll get on with what all this means in TTRPG terms, while you all have a nice time in the comments being really friendly and polite, please. So, how do we bring this to our game tables? What does this mean for the TTRPGs that we play, and what could we potentially tweak or even overhaul in order to find that happy place with lots of dice to roll but retaining that sense of the unknown? We need rules and structure, otherwise we don't have a game, we have a group story, telling tales to each other around the fire, which is fun, but it doesn't have that same sense of drama and peril that I think is unique to the TTRPG experience. I've realised that what I want my players to experience is soft magic at my table. What could soft magic look like in a game where we want to roll dice and for the results to have some meaning? If you're looking for some ways to freshen up magic in your games, to reawaken that sense of wonder and terror at the infinite void where the stars go to die and hope is but a mote in the absolute blackness? Wonder in your players in ways which are straightforward rather than completely overhauling things, then I've got some tips for you, from the least work to the toughest to implement. Number 1. Some good old-fashioned homebrewing and reskinning. It's a tip which often gets overlooked in favour of more dramatic surgery to games, but there's so much mileage in it. If you're playing D&D 5e, you could say everything in that player's handbook and the monster manual is just what the scholars wrote down. The world is much more wild than that. Off the edge of the map, well, here be dragons. One effective way to add mystery to things is to reskin magic and make original effects in the same way as you might do with monsters. You go so far as creating different schools of magic or mixing things up completely. It's a great way of making things feel fresh for experienced players. Though when they see an area of effect spell that does 8d6 damage on a dexterity save, they know that they're getting a reskinned fireball. Number 2. Allow and encourage your players to go a bit rogue. When I was a player in a Curse of Strahd D&D game, I was playing a wild magic sorcerer, and I agreed with my GM that I could occasionally attempt to cast spells above my character's level, or ones outside of their regular spell lists, but only as an absolute last resort. Sometimes they worked, other times they didn't. Every time, though, there was a cost to my character in terms of either hit points or some kind of narrative effect. Something like how Spellburn works in The Name of the Wind. I would classify sympathy as a hardish magic system and naming as soft magic. One day we'll get to read to the end of the trilogy and know for sure. I've said this before and I'll say it again, Patrick Rothfuss, we love you. Please take all the time you need. The setup we agreed upon allowed for some wonderfully tense moments and allowed my character to save the day a couple of times at great personal cost to herself, which gave me some wonderful roleplay moments that I wouldn't have had otherwise in a game of D&D 5e. If you're on the hunt for different TTRPGs to try, both Dungeon Crawl Classics and Index Card RPG have systems called Spellburn which give exactly this effect. Tip number 3. Borrow spells from other systems, especially for antagonists. This is your regular reminder as GM to read as many systems as you can. You'll find something interesting in almost every single one that you look at. I was reading Dungeon Crawl Classics again recently, and some of the spells are deliciously weird. One of the spells is called Obitu Q, where if you cast it well enough, then a giant 5-eyed demon skull appears above the caster's head. What's not to love? That's nowhere in any D&D sourcebook and will cause scenes of chaos at your table if your players think you're running everything by the book. Well, I am running things by the book. But you didn't think I'd stick to running it by your book, did you? Foolish mortals. You're the game master. You're allowed to break the rules at any time you like, as long as it's still fun for everyone. Dungeon Crawl Classics also has a cool system for giving a range of different effects depending on how well you roll. When I ran my 10-shot mini-campaign, I only showed my players the first level of each of the spells that they chose. It was up to them to find the limits of their powers as their characters developed. I think this is a really interesting way of doing things. I like the sense of exploration and, I wonder what happens if I do this. Sadly, this only works the first time you play a system with people. It will have diminishing returns when you try it again with the same changes, unless you're willing to try the final tip. Number 4 is more of a change of mindset than a rules modification. If you don't like how magic works, you could 1. Just not use it at all, or 2. Don't make your players roll for it. In the first approach, you can still say that magic exists in the world, but your players can't access it. This works well for low fantasy, low power stories where your characters are scrappy chancers rather than heroic heroes. For the other approach, perhaps player characters can access magic, but it's soft magic, which they don't understand. It's weird, whimsical, temperamental, and not to be trusted. The downside of this is that you're removing an element of play that a lot of people enjoy. It's worth checking with the group at session 0 to make sure everyone is up for working in the limitations that this sets. I think the reason that we don't see soft magic systems at work in many TTRPGs is because of a hangover from tactical and wargaming roots of the hobby. Both sides had to have clear rules of engagement in order for it to be a fair fight. These games work best when both sides have a knowledge of the rules that is as complete as possible. If you're adding magic to this mix in a wargaming mindset, it makes sense for these systems to be fully understandable by the players, so hard magic systems are what we see in so many TTRPGs. You could call this more adversarial way of thinking between the GM and the players low trust or a gamer style. But to step away from the chessboard and that actually rather nice analogy, I like to think of my TTRPGs as more of a high trust style than that. Although true high trust games are a topic for another video, for now I'll call my games more of a narrative first style. I still want my players to know the core rules and mechanics, and to be comfortable that they know the things that they can do and can't do on their turns, without having to ask me, the GM, every time. Having said that, I would still like for them to trust me, in that even though they don't know all the rules or how every system is going to work, that I'll still be making sure that it's a fair challenge for them. A good example of this is how almost every fantasy world has gods and devils to pray to or deal with, but it's rare to see codified rules for piety in terms of when to roll dice. Instead, it's often left to the whims of the GM to decide if and when to intercede and give players boons outside of their existing spell lists. Would it feel satisfying for Magic as a whole to be left this vague? My guess is, yeah, probably not. You'd have a lot of space for whimsy and weirdness, but I imagine that players would look for something they can control, at least partially. Another element which works against the soft magic setup for TTRPGs is that one of the core elements to many long-form games is the idea of progression and mastery. Characters level up, they gain new skills and power. For fighters, that's often getting physically stronger or learning some new moves. If you think what progression looks like for a caster of magic, it's almost always going to involve more powerful spells and greater control over their existing repertoire. But if you're a studious player with an entire player's handbook showing all the possible spells that you can ever cast, that finite list, you'll never be able to go outside. Are you happy with that? Are you content? I enjoy making low-level characters and daydreaming about how they might grow into their powers, looking at those capstone level 20 abilities and picturing the awesomeness they might unleash. Even though I know the vast majority of games finish long before that. The trouble is that their path in Magic is already mapped out, like a skill tree in a computer game or in a Brandon Sanderson chart. I think for Magic to feel magical, there always needs to be an unexplored horizon. Could we have a Magic system which is different for every campaign that we play, where the rules of Magic from one story just don't apply to another? Would that keep things fresh or make it frustrating? It certainly would be a ton of work, and by the time you've twisted a Magic system so much, you risk it not playing nicely with the other game mechanics. For a lot of games, a lot of tables, it's probably enough to twist things just enough to keep your players guessing without embarking on writing a novel's worth of homebrew just to make things interesting. If you're looking for inspiration outside of your game of choice, there are so many systems with so many cool interpretations of what Magic could look like and what it could mean in your game worlds. However much or little you choose to tweak things in your games, as we heard at the start of this video, Terry Pratchett, as usual, is very wise. It doesn't stop being Magic just because you know how it works. You can bring your players in to help with this, even if, and well, especially if they've read the player's handbook back to front. They can work with you to reskin or rework their spells. And just remember, it's your game, no one can tell you that you're doing it wrong. I don't have a guru-like, here is what you must do type solution, which in the case of these fundamental questions is probably for the best. I keep on uncovering more questions I just don't have answers to yet. If you think any of them are intriguing, or maybe you have more answers than me, please do let me know in the comments, and I'll probably make some follow-up videos to this one, continuing this dive a bit deeper into TTRPG philosophy. Also, if you like what I'm doing, please do subscribe to the channel. You'll hopefully see all my videos if the unknowable cosmic powers of the algorithm allow it. I also now have a Discord server, which friends of the channel are cordially invited to join. We play games, we talk nonsense, there's even a pet picks corner, all the good stuff. There's a link in the description with some details. I only started making videos at the start of this year, but it's already so cool to see how many of you stop by regularly. This video talks about TTRPG transcendence, where GMs and players find that creative flow and create some real-life magic together. I'll see you there or at a table near you, rolling an improbable succession of ones. Cheers.